Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and I just watched a new short track which is called The Trouble with Edward, and this one is kind of a mixed bag because I did like a lot of things in it, but also a lot of other things didn't really make sense. Once again continuity problems, once again characters behaving in a strange way that doesn't fit a Starfleet officer, once again a male character being humiliated by female characters, once again continuity mistakes with other Star Trek shows, and even internal continuity inconsistencies, and again scientific mistakes and nonsense, so there are a lot of trouble in this episode which I will review. But it also did have some good jokes which actually worked, and even the visual style was much better, much closer to the kind of tone I would like to see a Star Trek show, and even visually it looked much better, everything was bright, colorful, and they even added some props and some stuff that looks like the TOS era. So visually it was a step to the right direction, and the tone of the episode was very comedic, not taking itself too seriously, very humoristic, maybe even a little bit too much, because then it kind of ruins the realism of it completely. It kind of makes it all like a parody. It felt more like an Orville episode than an actual Star Trek episode, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I'm just saying this doesn't really, you can't take it seriously and you can't really tie it with continuity because of all the mistakes which I will go over. But first, just quickly to explain what it's about. So some young scientist from the Enterprise gets promoted to captain right away, even though she looks very young. We don't know what rank she was previously, but apparently they just jumped her right into a captain's rank and gave her command of a science ship, which they're sending to intervene on some alien civilization close to Klingon space without the Klingons knowing. Doesn't that kind of contradict the Prime Directive? So that kind of popped in my mind. What exactly are they doing there? And in the previous short track they mentioned something about the Prime Directive not being moral or not being logical, and in Discovery they said something about nation building, and so it seems to be like this new show is totally jettisoning all the ideas of Gene Roddenberry out the airlock, and even how all the stuff works in space. Like in all the previous shows they always told us that you have to drop to impulse when you enter a solar system and then approach in sublight speeds to planets. Otherwise it's dangerous, it's risky, they only did that in emergencies sometimes. And yet the very first shot of this short track we see the Enterprise arriving into orbit right next to an inhabited planet. We know it's inhabited because we see all those lights on the planet, so it's a heavily populated planet, and they warp right to it, stopping just a millisecond before colliding into it, which would be very dangerous. And I'd be fine with that if there was some kind of emergency and you just want to cut corners and you want to arrive faster, then I would be okay with that. But this is just a routine, normal day in Starfleet. There is no emergency, so why the hell are you warping to the planet and stopping in the very last second? Especially since in this new show we know that they don't really see anything in front of them when they're at warp. They always drop out of warp and almost collide with stuff, and so here you almost collided with an inhabited planet. And in my previous review of the short track I mentioned the turbo lifts. They're now moving at insane speeds through huge spaces, empty spaces inside the ship, which doesn't fit the other shows. And you could kind of forgive that on Discovery because it's a totally different kind of ship, but then we saw that on the Enterprise itself, and we saw the turbolift shafts of that same ship in the Star Trek movies, and it never looked like that. And so once again that's a very big continuity issue, and they keep claiming this is set in the Prime timeline, which is supposed to fit with the other movies and shows, and it doesn't. So anyway, this science lady who is promoted to captain, who kind of looks like Alita from Alita Battle Angel, she gets command of a new science ship, which is supposed to help some other planet deal with their food shortage, and then one of the science officers on the ship suggests using the tribbles for food. He says they are made out of purely meat under that fur and they would be a perfect food source, and of course everybody kind of sneers at him, everybody looks at him like he's crazy, because I guess they're all vegan in Starfleet, and there was a kind of a funny debate going on about the morality of using tribbles, if they might be intelligent and so on. So I kind of like that. Up until then I was fine with the episode, I was liking it, and that scientist guy is kind of quirky and strange, and so I thought, oh, that's a fun character, sort of like Barclay in TNG, kind of a strange quirky scientist, but he's brilliant, so that will redeem him. But instead they made him like just a total idiot by the end of the episode, and so he was never redeemable. And so you have to wonder, how did that guy even get into Starfleet? How was he allowed to be in Starfleet if he's like that, if he's so crazy? So anyway, he says that he can accelerate the tribals reproduction by adding human DNA into it, which I don't understand how that will even work. I mean, we humans don't really reproduce that quickly. So how does adding human DNA to the tribals make them reproduce faster? And also he says directly that the tribals are slow reproducing before this change. And this is a very big continuity mistake, because even in the prequel show Enterprise, which is set 100 years before this one, there was an episode in which Phlox showed a tribal and said that they are fast reproducing species who are considered a menace because of that and all of that. So the tribals are established as being fast reproducing way before any of this. And yet here the scientist says that they are slow reproducing. Now maybe he's just crazy, maybe for him it's too slow and actually they are fast reproducing, but it's not enough for him, he wants to accelerate it even more. Or maybe Phlox was exaggerating about the tribals a century earlier. And maybe this can explain how come that tribal that Lorca had was not reproducing, why it wasn't dangerous, that he kept it around as a pet, because they were not yet fast reproducing. In fact, I remember in my reviews I offered the idea that maybe they should genetically augment the tribals to turn them into a weapon against the Klingons, to eliminate their food supplies. I actually was hoping to see that kind of idea. But I did say then that the tribals were already fast reproducing, as mentioned by Phlox. They can simply accelerate it even more. And yet here the scientist guy says that they are slow reproducing, but maybe it's just in his mind. So anyway, all his ideas are quickly dismissed by Alita, who cancels his project. And also they constantly have all the women in the scene kind of humiliate him. They have him being unable to work on his pad, and then that black lady, who is a Trill apparently, fixes his device because he cannot do it himself. It kind of reminds me of what they did with Michael Burnham all the time. On Discovery, they constantly show that men are incapable of doing anything, everything falls from their hands, and she has to correct them all the time. They had scenes like that in Discovery, and we have the same kind of stuff here. So I'm really starting to wonder, is this deliberate? Is it simply an attempt to be funny as a joke? Or do they actually get instructions from someone that they have to humiliate the male characters to make the female ones look better all the time? Because it seems really strange. And as for that Trill lady, that's also a little bit of a continuity mistake to have her in Starfleet, because when the Trill were first introduced in TNG, it was stated by Troy and Picard that they know almost nothing about the Trill. Of course, later in Deep Space Nine they kind of changed the Trill and they had Trill in Starfleet, but we can assume they were new in Starfleet, and also we didn't even know if their planet is part of the Federation or not. It was never stated directly. We know that Dax had some interactions with Starfleet even at this time period, but maybe no one knew she's a Trill, no one knew her species. And yet here we see that there are Trill officers in Starfleet, and so how come they didn't know anything about the Trill by the time of TNG? It doesn't really make much sense. Unless I can maybe explain that Picard maybe meant that group of Trill who are hosts to symbiotes, who are a minority on the Trill planet, and they kind of maybe keep it all a secret to outsiders. They kind of keep it under wraps, that whole issue of being conjoined with symbionts. So maybe Starfleet and the Federation simply doesn't know about all of that, so I could maybe buy that excuse. The makeup of the Trill seems a little bit off. I think it would have been better off maybe to put it on one of the other characters in the scene, because you can't really see it well on her skin, and so at first I didn't even realize she's a Trill. I had to look really closely to notice that these are the Trill markings. It just looked kind of off, maybe because her hair is also very short, and so it looked like just a continuation of her hair, so it didn't really look that well. What I did like in these scenes are that three-way screen on the desk, which looked similar to the ones in TOS, so that was a nice attention to detail. I also like that little plastic cup that guy was drinking from, which looked similar to those cheap plastic cups they were always drinking from in the original series. And it did have a lot of funny moments. I think all the acting is great, all the actors were great in their roles. The problem I have with the writing, and my biggest problem, is that scene in which Alita starts to reprimand him, and she says she's transferring him to a different starship. And she was being so obnoxious in that scene, and didn't even let him say anything. Like, he wanted to respond, to say something, and she just shuts him up and doesn't let him talk. That's probably the most obnoxious behavior by a commanding officer I ever saw in any of the Star Trek shows. This is worse than Captain Jellicoe by a million times, because at least Jellicoe would hear you out. At least he would let you speak and say whatever you want to say. But here she literally doesn't let him say one more word. She just says, I decided to transfer you, goodbye, and I don't want to hear. And she just refuses to hear one more sentence out of him. And if this was in the very end of the episode, after all the crazy stuff he did, maybe it would be more understandable. But this is before all the crazy stuff starts, and so she immediately became so obnoxious. And he didn't yet do anything that wrong to deserve such a treatment. He only contacted Starfleet to complain about her, and he did that anonymously, and yet she's angry at him about that, and that's why she's been obnoxious. So is she really command material? I don't think so. This is kind of the behavior of a small child, the way she acted, just refusing to hear him out. She might have as well put her fingers into her ears and went kind of la 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 la, I don't hear you, la la la. That's the way she behaved in front of him. So this is the single most obnoxious behavior I ever saw from any Starfleet officer ever in all the Star Trek shows. And it wasn't funny. Like, if it was for a joke, if it was comedic, maybe I would have forgiven this, but it wasn't funny either. It was just super cringy and obnoxious, and so that kind of took me out of it completely. And once again, I'm kind of thinking, are they doing that deliberately to try to humiliate the male characters, to make the women look more powerful next to him? Does that really work if you present it like that? If you make the female character obnoxious, like a very nasty boss? I don't think anyone should behave like that in any kind of professional setting. So that was probably the worst moment in the whole episode. And even after that scene, she keeps being obnoxious toward him. She keeps reminding him, oh, a transport ship will soon come and take you away. It kind of reminds me of those parody edits I was making of Star Trek TNG, when I was deliberately kind of turning the show into kind of a mirror universe, making them all into evil a-holes all the time. And one of my recurring jokes there was Troy always telling everybody that they should be transferred to a transport ship all the time, where there will be less pressure. I was always inserting that line by Troy from an episode in which she kind of went psycho. She went evil in one episode and said that to someone. So in my edits, I was making her say that to everyone all the time. In any time someone has any trouble, she always said that. And so this scene kind of reminded me of that, because this captain is just as obnoxious as my recut version of Troy, who was being a total evil, crazy counselor, basically. So that really reminds me of that. So anyway, he violates orders and he injects the tribbles with human DNA, which somehow makes them reproduce faster, which doesn't make any sense. And then the tribble starts reproducing right away, and the special effect looked exactly like Gizmo in the Gremlins movies. Whenever Gizmo was reproducing, he was kind of ejecting little balls of fur out of his back, and then they turned to more gizmos. So they had a very similar effect here, even the same kind of sound effects. So it seems to be like a rip-off or a homage to the Gremlins movies. And I don't actually have a problem with that, because that is kind of a funny special effect. I don't think it can be any funnier. So I don't really mind that, I'm simply mentioning this. And what's strange is that these tribbles are reproducing 1,000,000 times faster than they did in TOS. Because in TOS, it took a few days for them to be all over the ship and all of that. And yet here it's literally in a few minutes or even seconds we see tribbles forming mountains of tribbles like immediately. Now maybe because that was kind of a montage, maybe a lot of time passed, maybe a few days. I think they said 2 days before the transport ship arrives, and so that means it had to be in less than 2 days. And they said something about exponential growth of the tribbles, but that's not exactly how it works. And it wasn't as fast as this in TOS, in which it took about 3 days, I think. And yet here, immediately the whole ship is getting full of tribbles, so much that they crush everybody inside the ship, and they crush the equipment, and they fill the ship completely. And another big problem with that scientifically is that, mass cannot come from nowhere. It has to eat something to reproduce. That was established in TOS, that the tribbles ate the grain storage from that space station, and that's how they were able to reproduce. And yet here they don't eat anything, they simply reproduce magically in a huge speed and just fill the whole ship immediately without ever eating anything that we see. And so it doesn't really make sense. It's kind of magical, like in that Gremlin movie, in which they showed us that if you just put one drop of water on a gizmo, immediately another gizmo appears who has the same size, the same mass. So that's kind of magic, and that's the way they do it in this episode. So all these tribbles simply reproduce magically. They don't seem to be aware of the law of conservation of mass and energy. If they said something about the tribbles extracting energy from the ship to reproduce or something like that, maybe I could buy it, that they are able to form matter out of energy, but they don't mention anything like that. And so simply magically they reproduce in such insane speed that it literally crushes people inside the ship. And these are supposed to be the same tribbles that later appeared in TOS, so why didn't they reproduce as quickly later on? And another big continuity issue is how come Dr. McCoy never heard about the tribbles? If all of this happened before, how come McCoy and Kirk never heard about the tribbles? It was established that no one on the Enterprise ever heard about the tribbles. Some merchant guy brought it from the far corners of the galaxy, and no one ever heard about it, and McCoy had no knowledge of it. And so if Starfleet encountered them before and created them even apparently, how come McCoy had no knowledge of it? How come he had to start from scratch to study them and couldn't look them up? I guess Starfleet made it all secret, that's the Discovery way of dealing with plot holes. They simply say they classified all of it, and that's why no one knows about it. Maybe they don't want to take responsibility for creating this new breed of tribbles who are so dangerous. Maybe that's why they decided to classify it. And when McCoy encounters the tribbles, he has to start from scratch to study them, and he knows nothing about them. Even though apparently multiple ships knew about the tribbles. Lorca had a pet tribble, Phlox knew about the tribbles a century earlier. I remember Scotty had one in that JJ timeline, and later McCoy was studying one in sickbay. And I remember when I watched that movie and when he injected Khan's blood into the tribble, I thought back then maybe that's how it will be accelerated to reproduce faster. They could have used that to explain it in that timeline, but they didn't, and so the tribbles were simply not dangerous for some reason. And here also we saw in Discovery that they did know about the tribbles, they did have them on their ships without a problem. So I guess this short trek explains that by saying they were not as fast reproducing previously, even though it contradicts what Phlox said. But at least internally they kind of fixed that little problem, and that's something I suggested myself back then. I said that Lorca is not just keeping it as a pet, but maybe he's planning to do something like this to infect the Klingon planets with it as part of the war effort and all of that, which never happened. And instead it all happens because some idiot scientist just decides to impregnate all the tribbles with his DNA apparently, and they kind of made the point out of it. They ask him whose DNA is that, and when he says it's his own DNA, they all go kind of, ooh. So what's the difference if it's his DNA or someone else's DNA? And I guess they tried to explain that line that they are born pregnant by saying that he impregnated them with his DNA, and they are all pregnant all the time, and that's why they reproduce faster now, even though according to Phlox they already were fast reproducing. And as I said, this is a million times worse than what we saw in TOS. So now there's like huge waves of tribbles just pouring all over the ship and filling it up completely, and they have to abandon the ship. And then they say the ship fell down to that planet and infected that whole planet with the tribbles, and because the planet is next to Klingon space, it somehow infected Klingon planets with it, which doesn't make much sense. How can tribbles infect other planets? Do they fly in space or what? So they have to get on a ship to get to another planet, but if they reproduce as quickly as they showed us here, then no ship would ever have time to get to another planet. So if it was like in that old show, in which it takes time for the tribbles to be discovered, then maybe it would make sense for them to infect other planets by gradually kind of sneaking on ships and being transported to other planets and only then becoming a menace. But if it's as quickly as they show us here, then they won't even get to the other planet before they're discovered, because there are so many of them. So it doesn't really make much sense. And again, if a whole planet was infected, if Starfleet officers died, a whole ship was lost, and yet McCoy never heard about the tribbles apparently. So this is another example of bad continuity. And there was another continuity mistake with the food slots. They called them replicators in that after credit segment, which was even more comedic, even more bizarre. So maybe we shouldn't take it seriously, because that was kind of total comedy. But still, they refer to the food slots as replicators, and that pissed me off because the food slots in TOS were not replicators. I made a whole video about it once, you can check it out. And also in TOS they always had to insert those little cards into the food slots before they can get their food. Maybe because the portions were limited or something, so they had to insert little cards to activate it, and yet in this show and in Discovery they never do that. They use it like a replicator from TNG era and onwards, and they even called it a replicator in the after credits parts, and that kind of pissed me off. And also they show that they are able to replicate living tribbles, which also doesn't make sense because it's been stated multiple times that the replicator cannot create living cells and living tissue. If it could do that, then you could be able to replicate whole people, and it's not possible. The replicator is only able to create dead meat. It's not able to create living animals. That's why the Klingon food never tastes well when it's replicated. It's been mentioned a lot of times in a lot of episodes that replicators cannot create living food, and yet we see that they are able to replicate tribbles. But that was in that after credit segment, which was totally silly, so maybe we shouldn't take it too seriously. But it still shows that the writers don't really know any of these details, and so that makes me kind of angry. And also that last segment wasn't that funny, it was more kind of disgusting. So they show little kids, like a commercial video of little kids eating tribbles from the replicator, so that's kind of nasty. And is it really what Star Trek came down to? So now it's just kind of a silly parody of itself without any original ideas, and so they just take funny stuff from the older shows and make it more comedic, like a self-parody, and just make fun of it, and they don't really add any new ideas to it at all. So is it really what Star Trek became? Instead of exploring some new ideas, they just recycle all the old stuff and they hyper it up. That's why the tribbles now reproduce at insane speeds and they fill up the whole ship in seconds, because it's more exciting this way, even though it doesn't make any sense scientifically, logically. There is no real mysteries to be solved, no real issues to explore. They kind of mention quickly morality and ethical problems with eating tribbles, but they don't really discuss it, they simply kind of dismiss it, and it's all done with this new attitude of humiliating characters, one character humiliating another one. So this male character gets humiliated by all the female characters, who are kind of being obnoxious. They're being kind of, oh, I'm so better than you, I'm so smarter than you, and that's really obnoxious, and I can't believe for 1 second that people would behave like that, not just in Starfleet, even today. People wouldn't behave that way in any place above school level. Like, the way they behaved was like little children, so I don't expect that kind of behavior from adults even today. I'm not even talking about the enlightened future in which people should be better than that. So even though a lot of parts in this episode were pretty funny, and I do give them points for that, but a lot of it was just unnecessarily obnoxious, and those parts were not funny, they were just cringy. And all the continuity mistakes show me once again that they don't really pay much attention to the details, and even internal continuity with themselves. For example, the uniforms in Season 2 of Discovery, Pike specifically said that they have the new uniforms on the Enterprise, and Michael even said, oh, very colorful, so it was as if it's the first time they see those kinds of uniforms. And yet, in the previous short trek, which was about Spock just arriving to the Enterprise for the first time, and he's just an ensign, so that's taking place years before Season 2 of Discovery, in which he's a commander, and yet they already have those same colorful uniforms, and so that doesn't fit the dialogue by Pike in Season 2, and so that's an example of an internal continuity mistake. And it shows me the laziness, it shows me that they don't really care about that. There is no one in charge of that, no one is keeping track of any of that. Kurtzman even said in an interview that it's impossible to maintain continuity, and therefore he kind of dismisses it, so it sounds as if he's not going to even try to maintain it, because he says there are 50 years of continuity, and it's impossible to do it perfectly. And so, kind of, what do you want? That was his attitude, and I'm saying to that, no one demands total perfection. People would have forgive small little mistakes, like the thrill thing I mentioned, that can easily be explained away with some excuse, and so stuff like that people won't really complain about. If the show will be good, we will be making up excuses to explain away all that stuff, just like we did in all the other Star Trek shows. They always had mistakes between shows and all of that. We always made up excuses and theories to explain them. We didn't hate the shows because of those little things. But your attitude, Kurtzman, is just completely dismissing all of that. You just show that you don't care at all about any of that. Your attitude seems to be like it's all or nothing. Because it's too hard to maintain perfect continuity, therefore I won't maintain any continuity. That's your attitude. And so that's annoying. That's your kind of lazy way of doing things. But anyway, we'll talk about all of that in a separate video. This one is just about this short trek, which I think relatively to the other ones, this one was at least entertaining. At least it was visually fun. The special effects looked great, some of the acting was good. The idea wasn't that bad, that's an idea I suggested in my reviews, but it should have been written a little bit differently to make sense. As for the comedy, as I said, I did enjoy some of the jokes, but a lot of them were too cringy, they went too far. It made it way too unrealistic, it made some of the characters obnoxious, and it kind of makes a joke out of Star Trek, and so if we look at it as purely as a parody, if we don't take it seriously, maybe it can be entertaining, but it won't be real Star Trek. Real Star Trek was a little more serious than that, and a little more clever than that, and originality, exploring new ideas, that's an important part of Star Trek, and it's been a long while since I've seen any new ideas in these new shows and movies, and that's my probably biggest problem with these new productions, which are basically just recycling all the old stuff and regurgitating it. So that's probably my biggest problem with it. Anyway, that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comments below and we can discuss it, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.